Yeah, so Jessica can obviously introduce herself. She's running for Assembly in Queens. We're going to start off with some questions that we have kind of written to get stuff started, and then halfway through or so, roughly, we'll open it up to questions that you guys have. So, Jessica, if you want to kind of talk a little bit about yourself, go for it.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Jessica Gonzalez-Rojas. I use she, her, job pronouns. And I am an activist running for New York State Assembly. I'm running in the districts of Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, Woodside. Actually, it's District 34, but the neighborhoods are Jackson Heights, East Elmhurst, Corona, and Woodside. And I was sharing a little bit earlier that we're basically the epicenter of coronavirus here in New York. This district is 88% people of color and nearly 60% which are Latino, Latinx. And we've never been represented by a person of color or a woman. So I'm excited to have raised my hand pretty much last summer to run for office in this community. I lived here for 21 years. I was born in Queens. And this has been my home where I'm raising my child in the public school. And I'm someone who's been driven by health, dignity, and justice, right? And looking at everything through a very intersectional lens. So my advocacy over the decades have been related to everything from disability justice, to education, to immigration, to LGBTQ liberation, to reproductive justice, gender justice. So that's the lens that I bring to this work. I've literally never had a corporate job outside of being a hostess at a Pizzeria Uno and our Friendly's ice cream, and working in a supermarket as a cashier. So everything I've ever done in my life has been about social justice and liberation and human rights. And I'm excited to be here with you all and to share more about the campaign. So I'll stop here because I think we'll go around.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for being here and spending your time during quarantine. We have like millions of other things you could be doing, but thank you for being here. And thank you, Jessica, for making the time to be here. So to get into things, for our first question, can you, again, talk about your work and what motivated you to get behind it? And can you give an overview of the reforms that you've fought for?
Oh, yeah. So as I mentioned a few seconds ago, I've really been working in the field of social justice and human rights my whole life. I went to college at Boston University and I studied international relations because I initially wanted to be a diplomat and wanted to work in the international field and work specifically with children in other countries. My father's from Paraguay, which is a teeny country in South America, and he's an immigrant, and my mom's from Puerto Rico. So I have, Latino experience. I understand the diaspora and all the issues that immigrants face in the US and migrants from Puerto Rico. So I really initially wanted to do that work, but it was actually an opportunity to work with Congresswoman Velasquez, who's the first Puerto Rican woman in Congress, that changed my whole trajectory. And this is right after I graduated college. And I got to really understand the domestic issues that were impacting the lives of our communities here in New York, and then also across the country because it was a federal position. It was a really cool program through the National Association of Latino Elected Officials, where I got to work in Nydia Velasquez's DC office for a period of time, and then I got placed in her local office, which back then, I'm definitely not Gen Z, I'm Gen X. So this is 1998. I got to work in her Corona office in Queens. So that connected me with the issues that people in my community face: housing, housing discrimination, immigration issues, challenges around like their social security. And then we would get questions about like broken light posts and dog poop in the neighborhood, right? So like the quality of life issues that the Congress didn't deal with, but I would always refer them to their state or their state assembly people or city council folks. So that like really exposed me to like domestic issues and what the communities were facing every day and the challenges they were facing. And from there, I really switched my career from thinking about international relations to more public policy and advocacy. So from there, I actually worked in many social justice movements. And I would argue that many of these movements are very siloed, right? So I worked in the immigrant justice movement I was a co-founder of a local immigrant rights organization, but it was very much about like the immigrant experience. I worked in higher education. It was very much like higher education. I worked in disability rights. I was very siloed on those issues. But it wasn't until I found an organization called the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, where I learned about intersectionality. And intersectionality is an idea that, you know, it's not just, particularly around reproductive justice, it's not just the ability to have an abortion or have access to birth control. It's about addressing all the conditions that our communities face to be able to build social, political, and economic power to make decisions about our health, family, and future, right? So immigration is a reproductive justice issue. LGBTQ liberation is a reproductive justice issue. You know, economic justice, criminal justice, all those things are interconnected in which impact our lives. And it's not just about women, right? It's about queer and trans people. It's about men. It's about children, about families, right? This is an issue that every single one of us, it impacts all of us. So I felt like I found a political home at Latina Institute, and I joined their team as the Director of Policy and Advocacy because I had gotten my master's at NYU Wagner School in public policy. But it really shaped kind of the framework in which I approach everything in my life, looking at issues through an intersectional lens. And a lot of the work I did was connecting communities, right? Latino, Latinx communities who have been disenfranchised, right? And ignored and, you know, quite devastated by the policies that our legislators pass, and help them shift their consciousness around their own power, right? We don't empower people. People have power. It's just about really unleashing that power, right? And shifting the consciousness around their ability to create change. So we'd work with communities, do leadership development, right? And think about like policy, power shifting, and then connect them to be like a bridge to elected officials and people that hold sort of positional power. And that was amazing. I love that work. We work here in New York, in DC, in Virginia, Florida, and Texas. And what I really learned over those years, and I was there 13 years, eventually becoming the executive director there. But what I learned over the years is that we just need better elected officials, right? Any of us that work in the kind of nonprofit or advocacy sector, that's amazing work, right? Because you're really working with impacted communities, right? And they can be the greatest levers of change. But, you know, if you have really awful politicians, you have really awful elected officials that are not listening to their communities, right? Not taking the guidance and their solutions and recommendations, then, you know, things don't change. So it wasn't until last year when I saw like a shift happening in the country around who was, and how you can run for office and who was winning. Right, my congresswoman is Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. My state senator is Jessica Ramos. Right, these are my neighboring assemblywoman was a formerly undocumented person named Catalina Cruz who won. It wasn't until seeing like those folks like run and win and be kind of unapologetically themselves that I was like, maybe I could do this. Because over the years, people said you should run for office, and I did. I actually ran in 2002. I ran for something called state committee, and I won. I want to stay there forever, right? I want to go and create change and, you know, mentor the next person, support the next generation to come in and continue that change and push boundaries. But if I can affect systemic change, that is incredibly powerful.
Yeah, thank you so much. Definitely, all the work you've done has definitely made you a great candidate for the position in Queens. And can you give us an overview as to what our healthcare system looks like today and some of the changes that you're proposing as a candidate?
Absolutely. So I did a lot of work on the Affordable Care Act. When I was at the National Latina Institute, one of our priorities was universal healthcare, right? And specifically, we wanted single payer healthcare that covered immigrants and documented people, and it covered all the full range and the full spectrum of reproductive healthcare, so including abortion. And those were sort of our two angles in that field, right? That's what we wanted to push because we knew that those were going to be two barriers. And I joke that it's not funny at all, but like the ACA, for Obamacare, what we ended up with was basically something that ran over women and backed up over immigrants, right? Like it was not what we wanted, and we fought and we fought and we fought. But we were able to create some change. Because of the work that we did in coalition with many other organizations, we were able to get birth control covered without copay. We were able to cover things like breast pumps for nursing parents, just like a full spectrum of reproductive health care that was included in the Affordable Care Act as essential care, right? There was a list of things that were saying any health insurance program has to cover these things. And basically any of the things that covered reproductive health care were things that we had fought for. Again, we were disappointed that abortion wasn't covered, and undocumented people were not covered. But we found some workarounds with like state funding. So in New York, an undocumented person can get an abortion covered by Medicaid because the state uses its money, right? So we're able to make sure that continued, but the federal government doesn't. So unfortunately, our healthcare system is a patchwork of, a state-federal partnership, and Obamacare really didn't achieve its potential. I know when we were initially talking about this in 2007, a lot of the advocates were really pushing for a single payer program, one that was universal, one that covered every person and every service. And we basically got health insurance reform. Like, we're still under a system in which health insurance companies benefit. They continue to get rich off the back of our healthcare and often denying our healthcare. The fight for pre-existing conditions to be covered was such a fight. And again, as we saw Trump get elected and some of these really awful Republicans come in, like, we saw that fight to take that away. And just so you know, pregnancy was a pre-existing condition. You can literally have been pregnant, and need healthcare, and they're like, well, you have this pre-existing condition called a pregnancy, so we will deny you based on that. So uncovering the inequities, uncovering the discrimination that the healthcare system held was part of the work that we were doing, right? Uncovering these issues and driving solutions. So, there have been some good progress, but again, the Affordable Care Act is not the solution at all. And what's exciting for me as a candidate is looking at the New York Health Act, which would essentially be more of a single payer program that would cover all services and all communities. So that's something I'm really committed to fighting for and working with advocates. There have been advocates at the front line for years fighting for the New York Health Act. I think we're getting closer and closer, right? But it's going to take a whole cadre of progressive electeds to come in and push these like stodgy incumbents that have been holding up the process to really drive change. So that's what I'm excited to do. And I hope that New York State can be the lever or the domino that impact other states and ultimately impacts the federal program. We need a federal universal healthcare program, period. But in the absence of leadership there, and I'm deeply, deeply concerned about the presidential race. So, until we have real leadership that's pushing at the federal level, it's up to the states, right? So states have a lot of power to change entire systems that impact the lives of all of us and the health of all of us. And I think in this moment around COVID-19, it's like more important than ever to ensure that every single person has healthcare that's not based on their employment.
Great, thank you. That's all really important. Following up on that and jumping off your work with the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, what policy proposals are you working on to make reproductive rights more accessible to all people in New York in particular?
Yeah, what's interesting, and this is why I point to the change that happened in 2018. Since 2006, and maybe even before that, but that's when I joined the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health. Since then, we were fighting for something called the Reproductive Health Act. And that would basically take abortion for years or decades have existed in the penal code of New York state policy, and would instead like codify abortion as a, New York state constitutionally accessible healthcare. So, and for, and abortion's been accessible. New York was one of the first states to legalize abortion, but where it sat in the penal code was complicated, and we needed to change that. And for decades, we fought to have that change, and it never moved, right? There was so many efforts over the years to get this thing passed, and it never did. And it wasn't until the 2018 election that brought a whole wave of progressive leaders that came in. And literally in 2019, I would go up to Albany every year fighting for it. And it was literally voted on, passed, and signed into law by the Roe v. Wade anniversary, which is January 22nd. So it was almost like I didn't even get up there in time because it just moved so quickly. And I'm like, this is what new leadership means, right? Something I've been fighting for 12 years, 12 years moved like that once we had new voices and new leaders. So the the Reproductive Health Act was something that was, had been the reproductive rights bill. But there's actually some new legislation that I'm really excited about, and I would have introduced myself, but we have really great people who have just introduced it this session, which is a fund to cover abortion care for the folks that can't afford other elements of it, right? Like the travel, the hotel stay, right? To maybe perhaps if they don't have an abortion clinic in their communities, any out-of-pocket costs that they face. So New York City passed an abortion fund law that they can use city taxpayer dollars to help folks who need it. But someone introduced it. I think Yulene and Catalina Cruz and some other badass women of color introduced that at the state level. So I'm super excited about that because that was something I was sort of dreaming about, like, oh, it'd be great to have that at the state level. So it's not just people in New York City, but across the whole state. And then really the New York Health Act is sort of, part and parcel of advancing reproductive health care. One other issue that I'm really passionate about and would plan to fight for, and is that in my kind of health policy agenda, is fighting for sexuality education as a mandate in the state. I don't know how many of you worked on sex ed issues. I know a lot of the young people have been at the forefront of fighting for sex ed, but every kind of community can have a different program, and some of these programs are racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic. I mean, they often replicate terrible gender tropes and stereotypes to scare people from having sex, right? And I want to make sure that we're moving us in a direction that we have culturally competent, medically accurate, age appropriate, and LGBTQ inclusive sex ed, right? And that's it must meet those criteria in order to be part of the curriculum in our schools across the state. So that's something that's really important to me, and looking at sex ed through the lens of consent, right? And the lens of healthy relationships, I think can radically change the way in which our communities connect with one another, and in ways that we can actually destigmatize sex and sexuality and create more respectful communities, right? That I really want to address hatred and discrimination and bias that many folks still face, right? Queer folks, women, people of color, gender nonconforming folks, right? I want to make sure that we're pushing as a state policies that will be very mindful of that, right? And ensure that any programs that are out there that we are that it's inclusive and supported by data. You don't know how many sex ed programs are not supported by data, and again are very sort of consent driven and inclusive of LGBTQIA communities.
Awesome. Well, you touched a little bit about this already, but we were wondering if you could talk about what reproductive justice would look like to you if you were elected, and why specifically you've chosen to spend so much time on this issue.
Yeah, I think many years ago when I was in college, my then partner and I went to Planned Parenthood to get birth control. And this is a long time ago. So it was before Google Maps. And I remember writing the address on a piece of paper to the local Planned Parenthood near Boston University. And I walked past a crowd of people and I just kept walking. And then I looked at the address and I was like, oh, it's back there. And my partner and I went to that space with the crowd, and they were protesters, right? And they were protesting this clinic. And I think I was just not politicized at that time. And I was like, what's happening? Like, why are they outside this clinic? And we had to get to the door, and literally getting to the door, between the sidewalk and the door, I was attacked, I was spit on, I was yelled at. People shoved these like horrible fake dead baby pictures in my face. They were like, don't do it. They were grabbing me. So, you know, and I remember being like, I'm just getting birth. Like, I just wanted to say, I'm just getting birth control. But it was that experience that showed me the barriers that so many people face. And I had so much privilege, right? I'm a Latina, but I speak English. I'm a US citizen. I was in college, right? I had a little bit of resources for my job at Pizzeria Uno to pay for it. And I remember getting to that door finally and trying to open that door, and I had to like buzz in, and they were on a speaker and they asked for my name to confirm that I had an appointment. I mean, it was horrifying. And what it told me was that so many people face so many barriers and so much stigma for just trying to get the healthcare that they need. And those protesters were not successful in denying me my healthcare, but they were successful in creating an activist. So it became like my life's mission to make sure that nobody, right, despite the language they speak, or how much money they have in their pocket, or their immigration status, or their gender identity, or their sexual orientation, should ever experience that kind of violence when trying to just get healthcare, right? The healthcare that they need, reproductive healthcare. So it wasn't even the first job I looked for or anything, but I always held that experience in my head. And again, when I found the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health, I'm like, oh my God, all my worlds are coming together, right? They, as I mentioned earlier, they work on immigration and Latino civil rights, and low-income communities and LGBT communities, all through a lens of reproductive justice that felt very inclusive and intersectional. And I felt like I found a political home. So, you know, the politics are personal, right? If you think about anything personal in your life, there's a political angle to it. And it just made it sort of my mission to fight for dignity and health and justice for everyone.
Awesome. Well, this is a little bit different, but like you said before, you're in the epicenter of the epicenter. What do you think COVID-19 has exposed about the failures in our healthcare system, and what could be done to address those?
Yeah. Again, we're in a healthcare system that your healthcare depends on your job. And we're in a moment where, I saw the numbers today, but it's 1.2 million people are applied for unemployment. Don't quote me, but it's a really sad and difficult number to think how many people have lost their jobs. And with losing your job, you lose your benefits, if you have benefits to begin with. So if you have benefits to begin with, if you have healthcare to begin with, those benefits are gone. And I believe healthcare is a human right, but our system doesn't. So COVID has really exposed the gaps in those systems, right? The fact that if everyone had access to healthcare, if everyone perhaps was even more healthy coming into this crisis, we would have been a little more resilient. But who's falling through the cracks? It's people of color, it's young people, it's immigrants, right? It's people that are a low income, the homeless, people in prisons and jails, and seniors, right? Many of them don't have access to healthcare, or have inadequate access to healthcare, right? They're in a health system that doesn't cover all sorts of needed medical requirements and necessities. And again, we're just used to getting these denial letters, right? How many times have I've even gone, and I know health policy. I've read the ACA, and sometimes I'll get a bill and I'm like, why do they want $56? Like, I don't understand. I paid my co-pays. And again, I have a privilege of having healthcare in this moment, although I won't by the end of this month because I'm full-time candidate. But it's a complicated system that even the PhDs sometimes can't figure it out. And again, it's really very much tied to your employment. And when we're in a society and in a moment, in a crisis where millions of people are losing their jobs, we're seeing major gaps. And we're seeing people that whether they have health insurance or not, are not even getting the healthcare that they need because of also the messaging around this issue. We're hearing messages like, don't go to the hospital unless you feel like you're dying or you can't breathe, right? And I'm worried that people who have some severe symptoms are still not going because they're fearful of catching COVID or getting it worse, or just don't think they should go because they're told not to go. And I can't imagine how many are just not going because they just don't have health insurance. So I think it's really exposed the gaps in the system, and then who's being covered by particularly the federal programs. It's certainly not the immigrant population in Queens, right? 62% of my residents here in this district are immigrants. And if you don't have documentation, or if you're married to someone who doesn't have documentation, you don't get any federal benefits at all. Nothing. So to me, I think it really matters who's in office, because policies change because of that, right? We have the green light bill, in which undocumented people can now get their driver's license because we had, a formerly undocumented person up in Albany, right? People who care deeply about immigrant communities. But we don't see that at the federal level, right? We still need to see more of that at the state level. And our communities are falling through the cracks, and COVID-19 has completely exposed that.
Yeah, thank you so much. And shifting to the people who are in office and to your campaign, what motivated you to get involved with activism and the progressive movement in general? And specifically, you have such an extensive activist resume between the New Immigrant Community Empowerment, Jackson Heights New Visions Democratic Club, New York City Transit Riders Council, and the New York City Young Women's Initiative. So how have you become such an involved New York City resident, and what motivated you to do so?
Yeah, I joked that I was progressive before it was cool. I feel like, for good or bad, right? The Trump election exposed the inequities in ways that impact white people, right? Like, I've been always working along communities of color and immigrant communities. And, a lot of folks were comfortable, right? And didn't experience xenophobia, transphobia, racism, sexism, right? Maybe sexism, but like they experienced it in a different way. And, I feel like there's a new crop of like progressive folks who are like activists, right, in the progressive movement. But my lens to this work has just been very personal, right? My father's an immigrant, my mom's Puerto Rican. I mean, that alone, you really understand the barriers that communities face. You really understand the discrimination, the real discrimination that communities deal with, and how much harder we have to work, right, to be treated somewhat even equally as others. So I think I've always been involved in progressive work just because it's been part of my DNA. But I think it was locally, it was really coming back from college, from Boston University in 1998, and interning with the Congresswoman and being connected to different leaders and different organizations was sort of like one leads to another, right? So I remember meeting this guy, Brian Puffolks, at a community meeting, and he told me about an organization he was starting called New Immigrant Community Empowerment. And it was not yet a fully fledged organization. It was sort of a scrappy group of immigrant activists in the neighborhood who were fighting to take down a sign that was put on the BQE that said, like, stuck in traffic, millions of immigrants come to this country every year. So blaming immigrants for traffic while you're sitting in traffic. So he was organizing folks, and I got involved, and we ended up starting a nonprofit organization. And that organization, I mean, it's amazing. They just celebrated the 20-year anniversary last year. And even though I stepped off the board in 2011, my partner's on the board. And actually just this morning, he went and delivered dozens of boxes of food to families who need it, mostly undocumented workers with the Mets and New Immigrant Community Empowerment. So, and then from there, I got connected to a group of like Latinas who are politically active in the city. And we started, I didn't even put this in my bio, but we started a Latina Political Action Committee to encourage other Latinas to run for office and raise money for them. And then for the 2020 census, I met somebody else who was really interested in like making sure our communities were redistricted in a way that, ensured fair representation. So I would be on a redistricting advisory committee. So it's almost like that networking has really, and showing passion and interest and desire to like create systemic change, right? What are the ways in which we can actually not just put band-aids on problems, but actually address like real solutions, like the way in which neighborhoods are districted, right? It has to be districted in a way that people can elect someone that looks like them, that understands their experience. And it's been amazing, and I've been really blessed with connecting with amazing people over the years that are doing super exciting stuff and supporting that work and blazing my own path in the process. So it's just part of my DNA.
Awesome. Well, we are up to opening it up to questions now. Shervia, sorry, I may have butchered that, but go for it.
You were talking a lot about how there needs to be reform in terms of sex ed and sort of taking reproductive justice head on at that level. How do you plan, because most NYC kids go to public school, how do you plan on integrating it into that system, especially when either in your district or statewide it might be met with a certain stigma from other people? So even though it is such an important thing, how do you plan on implementing it while also addressing those other issues that people might have?
Yeah, I mean, the good thing about policy is that, I mean, it's good and bad, right? Because like the legislature would pass a bill, and then there'd be a process by which the bill needs to be implemented, right? So it might go through a certain committee or a certain agency to then figure out how to meet the requirements of the bill. It's good because, it forces the school districts or whatever the entity, the Board of Education, Department of Ed, to do that. But it could be challenging because they might find creative ways to like not meet the requirements, right? Or so that there, things I would imagine would come up in terms of dealing with resistance. Is there an opt-out policy? I would argue, I've seen sex ed advocacy where people are fighting for an opt-in. I would absolutely refuse an opt-in. I would prefer an opt-out if there's, perhaps parents have like a religious reason to not want their child to have sex ed. And again, I think to the extent that we can have as many people receive that education is important. And what's important to me too, that is age appropriate, right? That, you can actually teach sex ed in kindergarten as long as it's age appropriate. You're talking about things in a way that meets their understanding. So it may, you may not be actually talking about sex, but you're talking about your body, you're talking about consent, about touching, and like things. It's met with culturally competent, age appropriate instruction. So I imagine there'd be some committee that has to figure out what curriculum is the proper one. But some things that I've seen in different states is that they've looked at like an opt-out offering if there's a particular reason the parent wouldn't want. But again, I think the messaging would have to address the stigma, right? And it's not about, every child's going to learn about intercourse at 5 years old, but that you're learning about your body, your health, your sexuality in ways that are affirming and age appropriate and culturally competent, right? So you're actually thinking about the culture of your community, of your district. So, we'd have to probably think about some of those, addressing those concerns, but it would have to go through a process in which it gets implemented. And then we'd have to make sure we're fighting for the money to fund it, because you pass a bill without funding, it has no teeth, right? And these things cost money. So we'd have to make sure that we could pass the bill, get it funded, and then make sure there's a equitable process to ensure its implementation. I think the challenge, just by the way, would be not the public schools, because anything we pass would impact the public schools, but rather the private schools. The private schools, the religious institutions, I don't know how charters would play in, so that would be interesting. I think that's where it might be more complicated. So I'd have to talk to like experts in that field to understand if a law's passed, is it because if it's a religious school, they might automatically be exempt? I'm not sure. I wouldn't want that to be the case. I would still want people maybe to opt out, but I think there's ways to address health and sexuality that could be respectful of people's religious beliefs.
Awesome. Well, our next question is from Eugenia. Sorry, I may have also butchered that.
Hi, my question is about how, like, as you've said before, people of color are more likely to suffer from poor health care. And that was evidently shown in like the COVID-19 outbreak, and suffer from illnesses such as asthma, etc. So how will your campaign help solve those issues?
Yeah, I think, again, passing the New York Health Act would be a really important way to address those issues. It would ensure that every single person has access to healthcare despite where they work. I do think we have to ensure that there's adequate funding, adequate education. Language access is another issue. I'm seeing in my community, information comes out in English, it trickles down to Spanish, and then trickles down to other languages, but it's not sort of rolling out equitably. So we have to make sure that, particularly health information in this moment is inclusive of all the languages spoken in the community. So we have to look at different layers of ways that people can access information and be able to access the healthcare that they need. But again, passing the New York Health Act, a lot is riding on the New York Health Act, but it's really an exciting bill that would radically change the way people access health in this state.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, so next we have Lucia.
Yeah, so I was wondering, so what future financial repercussions do you see the current pandemic having on Americans without adequate healthcare coverage?
Yeah, I think a lot of people, conservatives, argue against the cost of the healthcare bill as a deterrent from it, but it actually costs us more to not have it, right? We know that people are going to be put in debt. Either they're going to not get the healthcare they need and die, right? Or they're going to be put in debt that they can't pay because they don't have coverage and they're getting expensive bills that they can't meet. And that's just going to, again, further exacerbate a system that is already harming our communities. So there's going to be serious financial repercussions. There's easy solutions. We can tax the rich. The state has not taken seriously. I mean, I have to say, there's a lot of legislators who are amazing, badass, and pushing that forward, but the governor has not taken seriously the opportunity to tax the rich. And there's multiple ways in which rich people can be taxed, right? It could be millionaires, ultra millionaires, billionaires tax, second home taxes, right, on their homes in the Hamptons that they're enjoying in this moment. So there is potential revenue right there that can help, alleviate the burden that our state is experiencing in this crisis because of the health costs, because of the loss of jobs, because of the loss of wages, the loss of the economy. And we have a solution, and it's just we just need leaders that are ready to leverage their political clout and political courage to fight for it. But yeah, we're going to be in a deep economic crisis, and it's a little scary running for office knowing that that's going to be the cards we're dealt. But again, I think that's why we need folks that are ready to push for bold solutions to bring in the revenue we need to cover these costs and address it in the future, right? It's not just the Band-Aids, right? We have to create solutions so that, this is not going to be the only crisis we face. We face, 9/11, we face Sandy, we face this, right? There's always something that is a crisis that our state has to rise and create solutions for. So we just need to ensure that our communities, that there's a strong safety net that can catch people so that people aren't dying because they're poor, or people aren't dying because they're Black, or people aren't dying because they're an immigrant. So those are the things I really believe in.
So next we have a question from Stephen.
Oh, wait, hi. Okay, sorry. I don't know much about your campaign's platform, so I was just going to ask, what is your position on a city or a statewide housing guarantee or publicly owned power here in the city, like publicly owned power companies?
Yeah, absolutely. I signed the Homes Guarantee Pledge, so yay. And the public power is actually really exciting. I think there's certain parts of our lives that are just human rights. Like the fact that health is in the hands of private companies is unjust. The fact that our power is in the hands of private companies is unjust, right? The fact that these corporations are making money off the backs of our necessity to live is a problem. So I love the idea of power, the public power. I think I signed a pledge. Mia's on the phone. Mia, I signed the public power pledge, right? Yeah, okay. So, there's been really exciting conversations about that, and I'm really excited about that we're moving in a direction that we're actually talking about public utilities and ensuring that it's not owned by corporate interests that are making money and profits off the back of our lives. But just to quickly share my platform, I joke as someone who, I talked about intersectionality, right? How I see every issue impact another. As someone who considers themselves an intersectional reproductive justice activist, it is hard to say, like, here's my top 3 issues or my top 5 issues, because I think everything's interconnected. But essentially what rose to the top is healthcare, is fully funding our education system, is ensuring we go back to a free CUNY. The Excelsior program that's supposed to alleviate debt for students it fails our CUNY students because many CUNY students don't meet the criteria. And I was a CUNY adjunct, and I know my students had multiple jobs, they had families, they had challenges in their homes, right? Like alleviating the debt that they incur by having to pay tuitions is really important. So getting back to a free CUNY, fighting for a robust public transportation system. I actually believe our transportation system should be free, and we can start with the buses, and advancing any protections for our immigrant populations. So, immigration is largely a federal issue, but there's a lot we could do at the state level. And a lot of it has been done, right? Like the green light bill would have been something I would have been fighting for, and yay, we got that passed. But we should also make sure that we're protecting our immigrant communities when they access, healthcare, schools, churches, courts, right? Public transportation, right? That those are sort of sensitive locations. That's the term, the policy term used, that we protect any immigrants accessing those services from being accosted by ICE. I believe in abolishing ICE, but again, a lot of that is on the kind of federal level. But it is working also with other levels of government, right? The state is not divorced from the city, is not divorced from the federal government. So what's I think really special about me is that I have relationships at all levels, working in policy advocacy for 2 decades. I have friends in Congress. I have friends who are state reps in other states, right? And I could be like, hey, how did you pass that sex ed bill? Like, what were the fights you faced? What were the amendments you added, right? So I have a really wide range of relationships that can help build the coalitions needed to pass the policies that I want to see in the world.
Really, really great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, next we have Sharia.
Hi. I really think what you're trying to do is really great, and like it really represents a lot of beliefs that often go unheard. And I also love that you're so transparent about your ideas and what you're trying to do. And my question is, I have 2 questions. One of my questions is, how do you think, like, as young adults and teenagers interested in politics, we can like help, and like we can help? And also I was wondering, like, since like every state is kind of doing their own thing right now, do you think it's important that we develop like a nationwide plan for healthcare to get everyone on like the same page?
Yes, I love that. Yeah, what I was going to ask you all is, I was curious who was sort of interested in politics or maybe running for office in the future. And I think one of the best ways to just learn what that's like is to volunteer in a campaign. And it's super exciting to be able to participate in a campaign in ways that are like not that glamorous, right? Like people see campaigns and it seems really glamorous, but it's literally sitting on the phone for hours calling people, but those phone calls are so meaningful and beautiful. I mean, you get hung up on and yelled at, right? But then you'll get the person who is so grateful you called, or you've connected them to a resource that actually like improves their life. One really sweet story is that somebody called the campaign line after we left them a message and needed groceries and just, you know, couldn't leave their house because they were taking care of an elder. And it was a, you know, a South Asian man, immigrant. And I got him groceries. And this morning he sent a photo of his breakfast, like the food he made this morning because of the groceries I picked up for him, right? So it's like, you know, in all the tough moments, it's the reminder of the impact you're making on their lives, right? So, you know, it's the hours of phone banking that got this guy to call us back and got us to get him the food he needed for his breakfast. So, so definitely phone banking in this moment is really, really important, because I had planned to do like door knocking every single day, and those plans are gutted based on the, you know, not being able to get out and knock on doors. So we want to make sure to touch every voter in a way that we can, you know, A, check in on them, and B, remind them that like in the middle of this pandemic, there's an election, and it is a hard reminder. And we actually need people to fill out the application to receive an absentee ballot. So people need to take 2 steps. They need to apply to receive the ballot. They get the ballot, they need to fill it out, mail it in order to vote. So we're going to need lots of folks to volunteer and call people. And actually folks who speak multiple languages, I mean, everyone can do it. But if you actually speak additional languages, it's actually extra helpful, just because we have folks who in our community, there's nearly 200 languages spoken in my neighborhood. So the more kind of diversity in language that you have, the better. But if you don't speak any other language outside of English, that's totally fine as well, because if we call someone that needs somebody to follow up with them, we mark it, and then the campaign has people that speak different languages that can call back. So I do encourage folks to volunteer. Mia, can you put in the chat the phone bank link? So there's a sign up where you can sign up for Shift. And then, sorry, your second question was, you had a second question.
Yeah. Do you think it's important that we develop like a nationwide plan for healthcare to get like everyone on the same page?
Absolutely. I think a good example is to think about same-sex marriage, LGBTQ marriage. And it took states. It took states to start advancing laws, right, that changed the policies. Those laws changed hearts and minds, right? And then you just saw progression. State after state started passing these laws, right? And then it created a tipping point, and that tipping point influenced the country to be able to, you know, finally, you know, see the Supreme Court say, yes, equal marriage is something that we need in this country and is constitutional. So, you know, that it was the states that led that charge, right? And it was it was the activists, right? The people on the ground that fought for it, but it was like tipping the scales at the state level created a domino effect to influence the country. So if we could see, you know, New York and California and Oregon and Maine and who knows, Florida, we see all those states start passing their own versions of universal health care. It puts the pressure on our federal government to actually start looking seriously at advancing something more national. So I think to the extent that these states can work together, there's a bunch of different networks. There's like progressive legislator networks around the country. I'm a member of NALEO, which is the National Association of Latino Elected Officials. They're actually bipartisan, so I have some friends who are Republican. We have interesting conversations, but it's like Latino electeds across the country to like share strategies and build relationships. But there's a whole network of progressive legislators that are being brought, you know, together once or twice a year to, you know, at a conference, a convention, to really talk about what's happening in their state and share strategies, share languages, like bill language. And I think I mentioned I studied public policy, so like that kind of stuff is like fun for me, like reading policy and reading amendments, and it'd be exciting to actually say, learn from others as to how they're advancing their versions of universal health care, or their versions of like a homes guarantee platform, or their versions of criminal justice reform, because I think we could take lessons learned and best practices from what other states deal with in order to pass our own, and thus influence the country.
All right, thank you so much.
Okay, so last question, because we're getting close to 6 o'clock, is from Scott.
Oh, hello. So I was just wondering, I mean, you're seeing even more now that gig workers and 1099 workers are being influenced by not having the same regulations everyone else has. And going after this, we don't know if that trend will continue to happen, as we've seen, like even journalists now are considered 1099 workers. So what plans do you have, and what do you want to push for in Albany that would address those gig workers?
So this is a perfect example, back to Shreya's question, that California has a law that they passed called the ABC test. And it looks at the gig economy in ways that, because a lot of people are, they're being classified as gig workers, but they're not really gig workers, right? Corporations are trying to be creative and to not, cover benefits or healthcare, or adequate pay, or good working conditions. So there's this thing called the ABC test that was passed in California that could actually really address the problem. And I think there's some legislators that might have started moving on this in New York State. But I think because California passed that bill already, I think what'll be great is to actually be in a relationship with some of these legislators in California and say, okay, what are the problems you're facing? Like, every bill has a goal, but also every bill has an unintended consequence, right? Like maybe it actually hurts Uber drivers, or maybe it actually like maybe there's ways in which people are still falling through the cracks because they didn't think about something, or there's an unintended consequence. So I think what I would do is actually continue to look at what's happening in California and learn what their best practices are, and what are the amendments they needed to pass, or what are the gaps they needed to fill, or who are the stakeholders that needed to be brought on board, right? Is it the unions? Is it the big corporate companies, right? Like I'm not really inclined to work with the corporate companies, but perhaps if it could be in their best interest to push for something that, if we can convince them that this is good, they can help put some political weight behind it. But that's generally not my strategy, but I think it might be good to learn how others navigate those tricky dynamics, and seeing what are the creative solutions, right? And I think it is about not just looking at other policies, but actually bringing together gig workers and finding out what their needs are and how we can address those as well. So I think there's solutions not yet proposed that I'd be really, really open to learning, but learning by the people who are most impacted by those policies and that structure.
Thank you.
Thanks, Scott.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. We just wanted to give you an opportunity to say anything about your campaign. If people, you touched on this before and it's in the chat, but if people are interested in helping out, how they can do so. And yeah, any other kind of final information you want to give.
Yeah. I just thank you all. I'm just so inspired by you all, because like I talked about getting birth control, and when I was like 19 and I didn't understand why people were protesting, I was like, why are people protesting? And I'm like, oh, they hate women and they hate abortion and they want to attack me for that, right? And they think I'm getting an abortion by walking into a Planned Parenthood. That Planned Parenthood was later bombed, by the way, actually later that year. So the violence against our communities are very real, and that's why it's so important, again, to have leaders who are activists, right, that really understand the issues that our communities face. So I would love your support, like your individual support, because I think you're a nonprofit, but any members that want to volunteer, please do. We need as many folks on the phone as possible. It's really, really meaningful to have these conversations with community members and to make sure that we're enfranchising more people. Just a quick note, we have 124,000 people who live in the district, 35,000 who are registered Democrats, and of those 35,000, only 5,000 to 7,000 vote in a primary. So And in Queens, you vote for the Democrat in the primary, that Democrat generally doesn't even have a general election. There's usually there's no Republican or no conservative candidate. So only 5,000 to 7,000 people in a district of 124,000 is making the decision. So my goal was actually to enfranchise people, right? To have them inspired to actually vote when they haven't seen anyone that looks like them run in their district. So the more we can get out there and more we could talk to people and talk about my candidacy, the more we have a possibility of having someone who actually reflects the district to be representative of it. So your support would mean so much.
Awesome. And with that, you've mentioned like volunteer opportunities. We've just started a campaign initiative that our policy director, Gabe, can talk a little bit about. But we're really excited to be partnered with you guys if any of you are interested in volunteering. So Gabe.
Yeah, the initiative that we're starting, you fill out a short form that'll be on all of our media by tonight, and you just list what topics you're passionate about and how you want to help a campaign, and then Coalition Z will help pair you with campaigns that would be a good fit, so you'll be able to have the experience of working on campaigns and being able to help these people who are campaigning for really good things and good change within our communities.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys all for like coming out. Thank you, Jessica, again.